Meet Brian. Brian is a 49-year-old veteran from Albertville, Alabama.
Meet Michelle. Michelle is 19 years old and she lives with her 3-year-old son in Brooklyn, New York.
For the better part of their lives, both Brian and Michelle have been living in poverty. But what does it mean when we say that these people are impoverished? To add some perspective, let's look at Brian and Michelle's stories on a more personal level. Brian was born in Albertville in 1966. He grew up in a blue-collar family, but dropped out of high school in 1984 to join the Army. After 8 years of service, he was severely wounded in 1992 while serving in Somalia. He was medically discharged from the Army later that year.
Michelle was born in Brooklyn in 1996. She was raised by a single working-class mother who struggled to keep food on the table all through her childhood. When Michelle was 16, her boyfriend impregnated her. After her child was born, Michelle's boyfriend left her, and she had to drop out of school to take care of him full-time.
So what do these two have in common? Clearly life has dealt them a difficult hand, but a more political way to describe it would be to say that Brian and Michelle are living in poverty.
In examining the broad scope of poverty, we find that poverty is a limitation of basic capabilities due to economic deprivation, and it can be best measured through the SPM, Supplemental Poverty Measurement, because it functions as a practical analysis of poverty based on capability.
It's important to highlight a few aspects of this definition. Firstly, basic refers to the idea of fundamental dignity, which creates an ability to freely go out into the public without fear of shame. Many people feel that abstract concepts such as human dignity are difficult to measure and therefore are not an appropriate criteria for determining human poverty. However, we contend that there are objective capabilities which must be met to maintain a level of comfort and dignity in society. By way of example, a fisherman in Malawi may not necessarily require shoes to go to work every day. But if Michelle in Brooklyn walked into a store with no shoes on, she would be judged by the people around her and possibly kicked out of the store entirely. So rather than being ambiguous, determining what is required to maintain dignity in a society can really just be a matter of common sense.
Another important aspect of poverty is economic deprivation. This aspect is important because it clarifies the scope of poverty. By way of example, a person may be severely mentally handicapped to the point that their capability to hold a steady job or even communicate with other people may be impaired. However, if that person comes from a wealthy family, their problems are not rooted in economic deprivation, so they are not necessarily poor. With Brian and Michelle, their lack of capabilities chiefly exists in the fact that they have no money. As such, they live in poverty.
But what do we mean when we say capability? Capability typically contrasts with functioning, another means of analyzing poverty, and there's an important distinction to make between the two.
A person's capability consists of their capacity to do something, while their function consists of what they actually do. For example, both Brian and Shia LaBeouf have beards. In this sense, they have the same functioning.
However, they reach their functionings due to different capabilities. While Shia LaBeouf chooses to wear his beard as a fashion statement, Brian has a beard because he has no access to shaving cream and a razor. He is incapable of being clean-shaven. These distinctions matter in defining poverty because of the importance of the freedom of choice to human dignity.
Within the idea of capability lies an important distinction: internal versus combined. Internal capabilities are those within you. They are your capacity to be or do something. For example, Michelle naturally is great with numbers and flourished in any math-related setting all through the course of her education.
However, Michelle does not have the combined capability to utilize her skill because as a high school dropout, she does not have the institutional credential of a degree to allow her into a field like engineering or accounting, and even socially, she may be seen in a negative light for never completing high school. To really accomplish anything, both capabilities would be necessary. So in examining poverty, we find that much of what makes poor people poor does not stem from a lack of internal capabilities, but rather combined capabilities and social stigmas or institutions which contribute to the cycle of poverty.
The next important concept is understanding different styles of measurement. Two common categories of measurements are absolute and relative. Absolute measures set thresholds for poverty based on what resources are determined necessary to meet basic needs. Relative measures set thresholds for poverty based on a determined percentage of median household income, usually around 50%. Both of these styles have strengths and weaknesses.
America currently uses an absolute poverty measurement, the OPM, or official poverty measure, to measure poverty. This sort of measurement is convenient for a variety of reasons. Notably, it's black and white, so there's a definitive line which separates those in poverty from those who are not in poverty. It's very statistically oriented, so it can easily be determined how many people are in poverty, what their ages are, and what the racial and geographical makeup of poverty is. Absolute measures also tend to appeal to people's conception of poverty as a lack of resources. However, for its convenience, it also has substantial drawbacks. Primarily, it does not effectively measure poverty.
Among the OPM's many faults is its poverty threshold for conjecturing the cost of living. It uses the Orshansky threshold. This involves multiplying the cost of food by 3 to determine the cost of living.
And there are a few problems with employing this tactic now in 2015. Chiefly, it's based on data from the 1955 Household Food Consumption Survey, and at that time, the Department of Agriculture's Economy Food Plan determined a minimal food budget, which was multiplied by 3 because low-income families spent about 1/3 of their income on food. Today, however, food is about 1/6 of a modest budget, so the OPM simply cannot be calibrated to modern expenses.
The OPM suffers other faults as well. It does not group cohabitators together as a unit unless they are related, which complicates poverty statistics. Likewise, its resource measure is gross pre-tax income. Furthermore, it does not account for medical expenses, commuting costs, or geographical differences in the cost of living, all of which have a large impact on low-income families.
Overall, the appealing aspects of the OPM result from the fallacy of measurement, which is defining a concept based on the easiest means of measuring it. As Martha Nussbaum articulates the phenomenon, noting that a certain thing, let's say GDP, is easy to measure, people become convinced that that thing is the most pertinent or central thing. Many in America favor the OPM because it's concrete, simple, and easy to understand. However, we feel that it neglects too many realities concerning poverty. Later on, we will see exactly what picture of Brian and Michelle the OPM paints and how it compares to that of a more comprehensive measure.
Many European countries utilize a relative poverty measurement instead of the absolute poverty measurement used in the USA. This is based on the idea that a country's average standard of living affects the resources necessary to be a part of the community and maintain dignity. While there is some validity to this, failing to assess whether needs are met can lead to confusing conclusions about poverty. Theoretically, in a country where the median income is too low to afford adequate food and shelter because of economic depression, people could feasibly die of starvation due to lack of financial resources and not fall below the poverty line. The opposite could also occur, with someone below the poverty line being able to afford many luxury goods in a very rich country. Though these are extreme and improbable examples, they show the fallacy of a strictly relative measure.
An ideal equilibrium between relative and absolute measurements of poverty can be found in the SPM, a quasi-relative poverty measurement devised by the National Academy of Sciences. Let's see in context how it compares to the other measurements.
It's important to consider resource measurements in distinguishing the two systems. The OPM only considers pre-tax income in determining a person's wealth. Meanwhile, the SPM accounts for the sum of cash income plus in-kind benefits.
This is important to consider when measuring poverty. For example, Brian is unemployed, so by OPM measurements standards, he has no income. However, he does receive housing subsidies and SNAP to cover his FCSU needs. Likewise, Michelle has a job as a cashier, but the OPM still would not take into account her EITC, school lunch assistance for her son, and SNAP benefits. As such, the SPM provides a more realistic measurement of people's actual resources.
Likewise, it better assesses the real cost of living than the OPM. Notably, Brian is from rural Alabama, where the cost of living is merely a fraction of what it would cost Michelle to live in New York City. The SPM would account for their differing housing costs, while the OPM does not.
The SPM also measures real expenditures on FCSU needs at the 33rd percentile in America multiplied by 1.2. This means of measuring better considers what people need relative to their peers without losing sight of absolute needs. It allows room for non-FCSU needs by multiplying the basic cost of living by 1.2.
The SPM also subtracts various indiscretionary expenditures from the overall resource measurement. For example, Michelle needs to ride the subway every day to get to work. This expenditure is considered by the SPM, but not the OPM. Similarly, Brian copes with PTSD from his time in the Army, and the cost of therapy is factored into his expenses in the SPM, but not in the OPM.
Poverty is a lack of basic capabilities caused by economic deprivation.
It is tremendously important to have accurate measurement of how much poverty actually exists if one plans to have a chance of combating it.
The SPM considers every aspect of people's lives in assessing their needs in a much more effective way than the OPM. In an effort to fight poverty, it's important to be using the best tools, and clearly the SPM is the tool which will give society the most realistic picture of what poverty really is.